Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. So this is the last session before the end of the day, and potentially beer, if that is indeed still free over there. So this workshop is really just going through what I've called some tips on personal management, which sort of follows on a little bit from what Nectarios was just saying. I guess the way I would suggest or invite you to think about this is perhaps either you might already have a series of your own slides that you might want to put together, or that might be something that you would consider working towards. These are mine that I'm sharing, and I hope they're useful. But these things might work differently for you. So just to give a little bit of background, as I didn't actually introduce myself on Monday, and that was actually on purpose, because the concept that we're talking about is not really about any one individual, and I don't even believe it's particularly about the people that are presenting it. But as I'm about to talk about a bunch of tips, I think I'll just give you a little bit of background of sort of my career so far. So I started off working at Google, got a great insight into inner workings of one of the most. Went on to run a not-for-profit research body that was ranking big corporates on their greenhouse gas emissions. And we had an extremely limited budget, but we managed to crowdsource a network of about 350 volunteers over 4 years to produce a set of public rankings each year. That eventually morphed into what we'd consider a startup. So it was originally called ET-Index and then rebranded to Engage Tracking. And during the process of doing that, I guess I just went on that startup journey that Nectarios was just talking about. Luckily, it wasn't maybe 14 hours a day every day, but certainly an intense experience, particularly fundraising. We managed to raise just over about 1.5 million over the last few years, and that business currently employs, at last count, about 11 people. And so these are some of the things that I guess for me, I have found have helped me on that journey, and I've seen work for other people as well. As I say, it's very much something to tailor to yourself, but I would offer the advice that the sooner you build in good habits to your routine, the better. But I guess as I'm sort of saying at the moment, that really starts with the mindset. So maybe another way of putting it is thinking about what is the philosophy that you're taking into essentially really everything you're doing, but in particular how you might think about your own personal management, your own personal development. So there's this idea that certain people have a growth mindset, and there's a whole book about it, which you can decide to read, obviously, if you want, although I would say it's pretty much summarized in this core concept of a growth mindset. And what that really means is, it's a bit like the expression, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Sort of the idea that, well, we are how we are right now, we can never change, therefore don't bother. And what this book is essentially saying is that actually, well, we know now from various sort of developments in things like neuroscience around neuroplasticity, that actually we can change. We're changing neural pathways all the time, and the more you do something, which a habit, the greater the strength in those connections in the brain, and it's a lot easier to do it on repeat. And what this growth mindset is really all about is saying, well, actually, if I apply energy to something, I will be able to improve. And so, as we know from the data that is applicable to everyone, I guess my main point here is that being able to cultivate a growth mindset and always be looking to improve, I think is sort of ground zero for a good strategy in terms of how you might be thinking about these sort of things. So next up is a book that I've recommended and given to quite a few different people, which is called The Obstacle is the Way, a guy called Ryan Holiday. And this is taken from a series of journal entries or diaries that were written by Marcus Aurelius, the Roman general and emperor. And what's really interesting is that these diaries weren't actually intended for public consumption. They were personal, private diaries, and they were found. And in reading them, and Ryan does a great job at sort of piecing them together, there is just a treasure trove of wisdom from this great man, who was certainly very much a Stoic, well, a follower of the Stoic philosophy. And ultimately, as this title would suggest, it's the ability to reframe any challenge, any situation. So that obstacle, that thing that we think is insurmountable and is this massive problem that's going to ruin everything, if we can just look at it from a slightly different angle and maybe say, hang on a minute, maybe there's a new way forward here, maybe that becomes the new path. Now, the ability to turn any situation into an advantage and a strength, for me, I feel is the key strategy that you could really, if you can apply that everywhere. Obviously, it's easier said than done. But in terms of a mindset, you know, when the chips are down, to say, well, hang on a minute, you know, maybe, particularly if you can step back from that, you know, if you've just experienced something very traumatic, it's going to be an emotional experience, you're going to be stressed, and sometimes that doesn't allow us to think particularly clearly. So being able to take a step back, to reframe, to reevaluate, I think is particularly key. So I really recommend that book. It's a good one. There's another book actually of his I'm reading at the moment called Ego is the Enemy, which again has lots of interesting stories from different people along the way. And as the title would suggest, you know, a lot of it is about removing the ego. Okay, so here's another book that I've recommended to a lot of people over the years, which is called Essentialism. As again, the title here, so the disciplined pursuit of less, as the title would suggest. There's a lot of really great ideas in there, but at its core, it's really a disciplined philosophy of trying to distill things down to their essence, and really use that as a framework in general to think about how can I be most effective, how can I use my time. And they also talk about, for example, there's a case study in here of some entrepreneur who sort of nearly kills himself from working too hard, and the phrase that the author coins is protect the asset, and actually in our own lives the asset is us. So always making sure that we're thinking about that. But there's a few other bits in here, and that they kind of get echoed by a few other people, but certainly this idea of being able to say no to things is also very important. So you know, just as much as it might be about what you do, it's also about what you don't do, and I think that's a really important thing to think about. But yeah, another book I'd definitely recommend. Okay, so this is kind of actually from this Ego is the Enemy, the book here that I was mentioning. So, you know, the reality of life is that our expectations will not be met, we will lose, we will fail. And so really our ability to change the definition of success, in inverted commas, if that is even the right word, is really the key to how we are going to experience life. If we are continually, you know, our emotions are beholden to external events, we will often be disappointed. So the idea that ambition means tying your well-being to other people, to what other people say and do, whereas sanity means tying it to your own actions, which is a quote from Marcus Aurelius here. So, you know, if you think about, and we've probably all been there at times, that person maybe in the tube on a hot day at bank station who's, you know, really frustrated and going a bit nuts. And ultimately, it's a set of, you know, we're all in the same boat. It's not very nice being kind of like transported like live cattle underground, 40-degree temperature, but we can't change it. But what we can change is our reaction to that situation and how we deal with it. So yeah, so first part here really, how we frame things, our mindset. That is what we can control. But as I said, it's easier said than done, and so a large part of being able to cultivate that skill is about practice. So I think the first point to make here is really, as you're either, well, whatever stage you're at in your life, in your career, it's about thinking what practice can I develop to strengthen that muscle. So if you think about it, you know, as a muscle, I mean the brain is a muscle, developing habits that help develop the mindset that you want to develop. And to treat that really like you would any other important task on your to-do list. So self-care, personal management, however you want to frame it, should really be on your to-do list and allocated a specific amount of time, just like anything else, whether it be doing the washing, paying the bills, going to work, seeing family and friends. And I really suggest that it's very important to make sure that it gets accorded the right amount of time. So part of that, I think, is really intended to be, as I say, when we talk about practice, there's meditation. That seems to be a very common theme. We'll talk a little bit about somebody called Tim Ferriss, who is a sort of lifelong learner, and he interviews people, very highly successful people from around the world, and he always asks them about their routines, particularly their morning routines, their habits. And there's a very consistent trend. People have been practicing it for thousands of years, that meditation is a great tool for cultivating awareness, cultivating presence, and generally managing mental health. But often when somebody says the word meditation, particularly if you haven't done it before, I know I was in this position a few years ago, you might be thinking, well, I don't have a clear idea of what that is, or that doesn't feel like me. Meditation or having a practice doesn't have to be sitting down with your eyes closed and your legs crossed, although that can work. It could be doing anything really where that is a therapeutic practice that works for you, where you're effectively training your mind on something, or indeed maybe the idea really that you're perhaps training it on something like the breath to begin with, but specifically you're not actually trying to think of anything in particular. The idea is really it's more of a practice to clear the mind rather than having a specific thing that you're thinking of over and over again. However, that said, there are other practices that you might find that are a bit more what's the word, involving specific thought. So there's this idea of something like transcendental meditation. I remember hearing about this on a podcast a few years ago, and the person was explaining that you go and pay some sort of yogi lots of money to tell you a mantra that you will then repeat over and over. And I thought to myself, that sounds interesting, but I don't really feel like paying someone money to tell me what to think. But the idea that you could perhaps either think of something yourself that you might want to have more of, maybe on an in-breath, or less of on an out-breath. The ability to essentially visualize or speak to yourself in focusing on things maybe that you are, as I say, maybe wanting more of. A good example would be something like if you've got a big presentation to do, so let's say today, next hour or so, I've probably done a few of them now, but if you're feeling particularly nervous beforehand and you want to maybe be focusing on the idea of confidence, you might want to repeat that in your mind over a few times when you're in whatever kind of meditative state. Or perhaps you're feeling particularly anxious or stressed or whatever it might be. You might want to repeat that on your out-breath, almost as if you're expelling it. I think my point is that trying these things, experimenting with them, and finding what works for you is really the important message here. And it will be different for everybody. For me personally, it's going to the sauna. I find being in a very hot environment and it works for me. Okay, so cultivating mindfulness. I guess this is slightly similar thing here, but ultimately the goal is to be in tune with what's going on within yourself, but also those around you. And we've talked a bit about working in a team, for example. Most of the time we are working with other people. The ability to be aware and present in terms of what's going on around you, particularly with others, I would say is a very useful skill. But it also means that perhaps sometimes you can catch yourself before reacting. I remember one of the first books I read out of university, sort of the main lesson was sort of saying, never react, but always act. And I think developing almost, whatever you want to call it, a mindfulness practice that just enables you sometimes to perhaps absorb a shock from someone else. Maybe somebody comes and shouts at you, says something really horrible, and most a reasonable reaction at times might be to sort of react back, but then you end up in a spiraling conflict, whereas actually having a bit more empathy, understanding where that's coming from, and being able to diffuse the situation might actually be more beneficial to the group and yourself. Okay, so reset. I guess this is a point. So yesterday, I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was working on this presentation, and sort of had just an energy dip, and felt like I didn't really have the energy to do it, probably because of talking a lot on Monday. If that happens, always thinking, well, maybe actually just resetting, changing the scene, going for a walk, breaking it up can be a useful activity. And it might be that you find there are different things that help you reset more than others. Some are probably more healthy than others. I know that going for a cigarette isn't necessarily the best one, but that often gets used. Okay, so we've mentioned this earlier in the last talk, but perfection is the enemy of the good. Trying to achieve 100% perfect perfection will always be potentially a hiding to nothing, and consume an awful lot of energy and resource. So knowing when something is good enough, obviously we want a standard that is, ideally 95% plus, but 100% that is likely always to be elusive. So making the distinction between what is important and what is not, and being sure to continue the momentum, because ultimately, if we spend too long waiting around for 100% perfect with the climate change problem, well, who knows what will happen, but we'll leave that to another discussion. Okay, iterate. So again, this is something we just talked about in the context of startups in general, but I think this is just as applicable to ourselves and the strategies that we employ. But try things. If it's not working, then consider pivoting and trying something else. It might be that getting up at 5, in fact, there's a person who's going to come and talk to us on Friday, was telling us about a sleeping regime he had, where I think he was going to bed at 8 o'clock, getting up at 4 in the morning. That was something he tried. I know if I tried that, it probably wouldn't work, but try things. If it doesn't, try something else. But crucially, doing the same thing over and over again, if it's not working, is probably not that healthy. So don't be afraid to change things up. Okay, so optimize, personalize. So thinking about things, and I think this is definitely something that in a startup environment or an environment which is employing more of a flexible working culture, as we would certainly be expecting to happen within this interdependence movement, it means that you can actually dictate when you're working, when you're doing things. And so thinking about, for example, when am I most productive, but maybe even more granular, when am I most productive for certain tasks? So I know that for me personally, something like 8 in the morning till half 11, 12 is the best time if I need to write copy. And I know that just after lunch and between 4, that's probably my sort of dip of the day. And so sometimes that's when I will go to the gym or do something else, do some exercise. But I think it's really important to try and find those data points for yourself and then calibrate and optimize for them. Tuning into your body, it sounds obvious, but I feel like in our society that sort of maybe repels against that a little bit. We're not always doing it. It can be simple things. I used to work from home with a flatmate, and we used to eat ridiculously, sort of carbohydrate overdose at lunchtime, and then we would just have a massive crash. But it also, can be things like, if you are feeling a little bit low on energy, maybe a little bit more irritable than normal, just asking, well, is that because I didn't have enough sleep? Do I need to eat something? Have I drunk enough water? So tuning into your body is really, really key. What helps me be productive? So here, I guess it's thinking about what tricks work for you. And again, it will be completely personal, but it might be that setting yourself a reward. If I do this thing, I will treat myself to, hopefully something healthy, but whatever it might be. So really just thinking about what are the hacks that help me personally. I know that, so I used to be somebody who would work like this at a computer, and then I realized that I had a back, and now I use an ergonomic keyboard. I know that that makes me 100 times more productive than working at a laptop. And there might be different things for each of you. Having the right tools for the job is always really important. So another thing here, a friend of mine mentioned a few years ago that one of his colleagues would systematically book a day in the calendar once a month just to take time off, just to think, just to evaluate where they were at. And since I heard that, I've really tried to integrate it into my life and the way I do things. And I think it's just really important with whatever you're doing, but particularly if it requires any strategic thinking, but I would argue that life requires strategic thinking in general, just to have that little bit of distance where you're able to take a step back and think, well, okay, maybe just having the time to cogitate on something or to think about whether or not it all fits together. Things change quite quickly, quite dynamically. So yeah, really, perhaps as part of that thinking about cultivating a practice, also thinking about, am I making space to actually think? So again, I've sort of touched on this briefly, but it's as simple as it might sound, sort of story from eating too much at lunchtime, but I find the difference in my performance if I eat a salad at lunchtime versus a heavy meal. In one scenario, the afternoon is written off, in the other one, I'm really productive. These little things. Water. So I always find myself sitting around drinking water while I see no one else ever doing it. I would say water is one of the key helping agents for concentration. You can look it up, but we also about 80% water, so cheers. Again, yeah, definitely very helpful for concentration. Sleep. So we talked about that briefly, and there's some really interesting videos out there which pretty much explain that not having enough sleep is just terrible for us. So every individual will require a certain amount of sleep, and you can even optimize that by actually measuring your sleep patterns. There are various apps you can get which will wake you up at the right time. But it's absolutely critical to get enough sleep. And there's even data to suggest that people who haven't had enough sleep tend to overrate their performance in general, but then also think that they don't need sleep. So your mental faculties are generally impaired to the point where you don't even realize that it's damaging you. Okay, so here's a couple of things that Tim Ferriss, who is sort of Mr. Productivity, some tips I've sort of taken from him. Now, when you're thinking about your to-do list, grouping activities can be really helpful. There are certain tasks that you might find require what I would call deep work, where you need to be really focused. Let's say you've got to write a report and it's 4 or 5 pages, and then they might have 20 micro tasks that are all just a little bit annoying, but they have to be done, and they might take an hour or something. So trying to think about things that are similar in characteristics and then batching them can be a good way so that you can save a bit of time. What can I say no to? So that's also, I think, a really key point. I think if we're not careful in general, we live in a world full of opportunity, so many people coming and offering us things we can get involved with. And sometimes it can be social gatherings or whatever it might be, but thinking consciously about managing your own time and owning it so that we're not being pulled in directions by other people, which might not quite be the path that we want to be on. What can I automate? So there are, with technology nowadays, there are many things that we can automate in the digital realm. So some of you may have seen, for example, us using Calendly to schedule meetings. So rather than having a 20 email back and forth about when you're available, click a button, great, that's a real time saver. But more generally, outside of the digital realm, there's also the idea really of what decisions can I automate. So I used to work in Canary Wharf, and pretty much every day I ate the same thing. I ate a falafel. It was pretty healthy. But part of the reason I did that was so that I wouldn't have to decide almost every day what I was going to eat. You've seen somebody like Mark Zuckerberg in the film where he's got one outfit, 20 of them or whatever it might be. But thinking about keeping your creative energy and brain power for the decisions that really matter, and thinking about what decisions can you pretty much just have on repeat and automate, I think is another useful tip. So this book, The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, so his catchphrase is optimal minimal, which I think is quite nice. His podcast is great. As I mentioned before, he gets very interesting people from all over to come and talk about how, well, to share their lessons, really. And that includes lots of tips in there. Just as sort of as a concept, I mean, ultimately what he's really talking about, I guess he's challenging the conventional wisdom that we need to be working 9 to 5 every day. And it's this idea of, do you want to be a business owner that perhaps owns a business where you might create and set up a process and then step away from it, or do you actually want to be a business manager? So if you open a restaurant, for example, and you work probably 12 hours a day every day, very different concepts. So thinking about how you can almost design yourself out of the process if you're setting something up very early is a very different mindset. Okay, so talked a little bit about this earlier, but in terms of support, if you're trying to do something that, say, is extraordinary, you are going to need help in doing it, and you're going to need support from people around you, and to think about it very seriously yourself. So I think the first question is thinking, do I have the right people around me? It's often said that we end up being the average of the 5 people that we hang out with the most. So thinking about, are those people that I'm surrounding myself with really helping me to achieve my goals and inspiring me, pushing me forward? Do I have good mentors? I think this is a really important point here, just to say that it is a great idea to get 1 or more mentors, and definitely to choose them wisely. If you're putting a lot of trust in somebody to guide you along the way, you really want to make sure that they've got your best interests at heart. But yeah, I would say that it's a really, if you don't already have someone that you feel occupies that mentor role, I would suggest thinking about, who do you know already that's somebody that you respect, maybe somebody that you aspire to be more like, that might be able to help you along the way. And I think what you find is that if you ask people for help, they often will give it. People like helping other people. So slightly different here from a mentor, but having somebody impartial that you can talk to, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a therapist, although it's not the worst idea, but somebody in the dynamic that is a little bit removed. So talked earlier about startups, but it could be at work or whatever it might be. Is there someone that you can go and have a conversation with if there's a particular challenge that you're facing? And you could even do that as a almost like not exactly a skill share, but almost you talked about whatever's on your mind for half an hour, I'll talk about what's on my mind for half an hour. You can have those kind of support groups, even just with one other person. Okay, so deep work. All right, so there's no such thing as multitasking. There's only doing multiple things badly. Simon Sinek. So when I was a teenager, I used to think I could do 20 things at once. I've since realized that is absolutely a disaster. I don't recommend it. The times when I've made the biggest sort of stupid mistakes, like sending the wrong email or something, have been when I've been trying to multitask. The data suggests that shifting between tasks can cost as much as 40% of someone's productive time. And part of that is because once you are distracted into something else, your brain is kind of being sucked out of one task and fragmented into how many other ones you might be doing. It's difficult to then come back to the task that you were previously doing. And there's a Stanford study which essentially says if you're multitasking on a regular basis, you become less effective when multitasking, you become less effective when not multitasking, and you become less effective at prioritizing to achieve goals in general. So the data would seem to suggest that multitasking is not a good idea. Which leads me on to my next point. So when you are trying to be in deep work, but also present in pretty much any situation, particularly a meeting with a fellow human, I would suggest either not having your phone at all, and I seem to remember reading somewhere that even having it on the table can be stressful, even if it's face down. So I would say having it just out of sight, out of mind. But if you do need to have it on the table, and I know sometimes we are kind of on call, having it at least face down is better than it flashing in people's faces. Okay. All right, so on that theme, I think this is something I've noticed over the last 5 years or so. I feel like there didn't used to be so many notifications popping up at us left, right, and center, whether it be on our computer or on our phones. But if you want to be productive and be effective in pretty much whatever task you're doing, if we know that being distracted is reducing your productivity like this, then having things in your peripheral vision pop up is not helpful. So you can turn them off on all computers, on all devices. Just do it. It will also make you a lot less stressed. A couple of years ago, I found the button on my phone that disabled email notifications. My stress level went down like this. It was great. If you haven't done it, I recommend it. I also recommend doing it for things like WhatsApp, text message. Just get rid of notifications. Just do it. Try it. So did I mention turn off notifications? That's definitely the one. And also just no notifications. That really is a pet thing of mine. Okay, so lastly, just to wrap up, purpose. So I think one of the things that's really important as we are all on our journeys, and they're all very individual to us, is thinking about what's the purpose, what motivates me, what's my mission. And if you can align that to something that is bigger than yourself and not about the ego, I think it will always be easier to come back to cutting through that priority list and thinking, what is it that is going to be most helpful in getting me to that goal, or helping us realize that goal collectively, whatever it might be. So we talked a little about preparation earlier. So by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. Benjamin Franklin. I think it's absolutely key with whatever you're doing, even if it's what seems like a quick task, just to take a minute or so to plan it out. Bit of paper, sketch it out, however you want to do it. That investment, there's so many times where I've run off sort of very eager to get something done without really thinking about it, and then I've had to do it again, or there's been mistakes. I think this is a habit that is just really worth getting into, and particularly if you think about it, the more people you work with, it's almost like the more complexity and the more room for error. So many times people can be on a different page. It just really makes sense to prepare and prepare well. So just final point here really about working hard. So I would say that whilst pretty much nothing was achieved, nothing great was achieved without having to work hard. And I think that's just sadly the reality, is that you can work smarter and not harder, and that's still working hard in my opinion. Not just working hard for working hard's sake, but the reality is you're going to have to put the time in if you want to be effective. But the last point, don't burn yourself out in the process. I've been there, it's not pretty. If you haven't been there, don't think it won't happen to you, because it could. So yeah, really about looking after yourself in that process. And that's it. Thanks very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Any questions? I just thought I'd throw in, have you read Atomic Habits?
I haven't.
I read that in January, just after my New Year's resolutions. It's really good. It's just a book that's all about how to form habits in order to achieve these goals. And he mentions a lot of interesting points about how try and make it really easy, and try and put something in front of you that can trigger you to remind you that these are the good habits that you can do. Set yourself a goal to just do your good habit for 2 minutes, or 5 minutes, something really, really achievable. And one of the things he says is do something for a short time frequently. So if you do something, if you want to do yoga every day, aim to do it for 2 minutes every day of the week, and by doing that, you kind of get your habit set in stone. So that's a really good book, Atomic Habits as well.
Great, yeah. Sounds like a good advice.
There are actually repetition is the secret to grow your mind and knowledge. I think in recent years they did lots of research. There was, before starting the master, it has been away 25 years of academia. I wasn't scared. And it was quite a very scary, even if you approach a certain level of math. Repetition. It's incredible. The brain is like a muscle that reacts. It doesn't just react, it prompt you upwards. Just so like, you after a while you find yourself in a fast track. It's quite interesting.
I think often we're sitting around waiting for motivation to strike, to take action. But actually, one of the other things they say in this book is that you can take action, and that can feed into motivation. So you can create motivation for yourself by doing something. So you can form your own motivation. And this is there's a lot of people who say discipline is more important than motivation. Is in just get yourself out the door, get yourself started on what you're doing, and you'll find that you generate the motivation to keep going. So
yeah, because that was another thing that I found out. Especially, for example, it's classical. It's a classic when you do an essay on some subject you are not really strong into, and there's always a bit of uncertainty at the very start. Normally, the 2,500 to 2,000 word takes between the pen and the skills 1 week to 10 days. But I found with my colleagues that always the first 5-6 days is general panic because you read. Then all of a sudden you have a breakthrough, and everything you read before has a sense, but you realize also something else is missing, so you keep reading in order to find the matches that allow you to concise the information and to produce a readable piece of something. So that means that basically we can working hard. It's interesting when you say work hard before. You pause for a second because you were unsure how to put it across. Because also, I thought perhaps you were concerned to go back on your previous sentences like you need to sleep, you need to drink, you need blah, blah, blah. But they say work hard. What is work hard? I think that is work hard, not be afraid, but also not being concerned. Have the clear mind, clear vision that if you apply yourself, you will reach somehow something.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think there's just also this thing that it does take time to do certain things, and depending on the complexity or the difficulty or just how much time it takes, that's just a sort of fact of most work or most projects. But yeah, it's just finding that balance and using the right habits and tips.
The word balance is a key word because you can be unbalanced and then all the process will fade away because time and stress or losing the initial vision. I can do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like the fact that you make a point about some of the words you need to define for yourself what it actually means to you, because it's not like a one-size-fits-all type thing. But it also requires an element of self-awareness, which you need to, in some cases, learn. So not everybody goes through life having an understanding of how they work, how they function, what are the triggers. But some of this comes with that, which I think is paramount to some of the stuff we talked about earlier. It's just knowing what works for you, what doesn't work for you, where do you get nervous and scared, where do you are more prepared to take a risk. And experimenting with some of these things is important to just try something. If it doesn't work, leave it to the next one.
It's a very scientific process, really, isn't it? I mean, it's quite easy to think of ourselves as individuals and that we're all unique and all that sort of stuff. But actually, we're all quite mechanical in the processes that we respond to. Like we're talking about repetition, they're pretty standard across all humans. And if you learn to hack them, then you learn to access bits of your mind. I remember one trick I learned from anyone heard of Tony Buzan, the guy who's credited with inventing mind mapping? So one of the tips he suggests for implanting bits of information into the bit of your brain that you remember, like your parents' phone number or your names of old friends. That bit of your memory is a certain bit of your brain, and there's a way you can get information into that, and it's to do with degrees of repetition. So it's actually an exponential curve of repeating something at certain intervals. So you repeat the information after 15 seconds, and then after a minute, and then after an hour, and then after 6 hours, and then after 3 days. And if you follow that curve, it goes into that bit of your brain, and you never forget it. But it's things like that. There's a lot of emphasis put on our individuality and how unique we are, but actually we're very mechanical. We're well studied. There's lots of people who've done pretty concise analysis of how the brain works and use it. It's all there.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks very much, everyone. I think we'll wrap up there.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks to you too. I hope our paths will cross again.